Most people look at an older man sitting alone in a quiet house and assume something must have gone wrong. They think solitude is what happens when life disappoints you, when love fades, when the world slowly leaves you behind. But that is not always the truth. Sometimes solitude is not loss. Sometimes it is the first honest choice a man has made in decades. There's a moment many older men reach, though few ever talk about it out loud, when compromise stops feeling noble and starts feeling expensive. Not expensive in dollars, but in energy, dignity, peace of mind. A man can spend years telling himself that keeping the relationship together is worth the silence, worth the tension, worth the constant adjusting of his needs to make someone else more comfortable. He can call it maturity. He can call it patience. He can even call it love. But eventually, if he has lived long enough and paid close enough attention, he begins to see the pattern clearly. He notices that every time he bends too far, something inside him goes quiet. Every time he swallows what he really feels, the room gets heavier. Every time he says yes when his spirit is already tired, he gives away another piece of the life he has left. And one day, usually later than it should have come, he realizes the peace he has been looking for was never hiding inside more compromise. It was waiting on the other side of it. That is when solitude stops looking like emptiness. That is when it starts feeling like freedom. And for many older men, that is not the end of the story. It is where the real one finally begins. The truth is, the world has a very simple story it tells about men like Daniel Walker, and it is a story that sounds convincing until you look closer. It says that when a man pulls back, when he stops trying to fix everything, when he no longer bends to keep things together, something inside him must have broken. It labels him as distant, difficult, maybe even bitter. People see the quiet house, the slower routine, the absence of constant interaction, and they assume it is a sign of decline. But what they never see is what came before that silence. They never see the years Daniel spent showing up. When he was already drained, the conversations where he explained himself over and over hoping to finally be understood, the small compromises that seemed harmless in a moment, but slowly reshaped his entire life. They never see how normal it became for him to adjust his tone, his schedule, even his reactions just to avoid tension. And because they never see that, they misunderstand the shift completely. What looks like withdrawal from the outside is often the result of a man finally paying attention to a pattern he ignored for too long. Daniel did not wake up one day and decide to disconnect from the world. He reached a point where continuing the same pattern no longer made sense. The energy it required no longer felt justified. The peace it cost was no longer negotiable. And once a man sees that clearly, once he recognizes the difference between connection and constant self-adjustment, he cannot unsee it. The silence that follows is not emptiness. It is clarity settling in for the first time in years. There is a version of Daniel Walker that most people would recognize immediately. A version of him that believed being a good man meant being the one who adjusted first, spoke softer, stayed longer, and tried harder even when something already felt off. He was the one who stayed in conversations long after they stopped being honest, who chose calm over truth because he thought that was what kept relationships alive. If something felt unbalanced, his instinct was not to question it, but to fix himself first. Maybe he was asking for too much. Maybe he needed to be more patient. Maybe this was just what commitment looked like over time. And so he kept showing up in that way again and again, convincing himself that consistency would eventually turn effort into understanding. But what he did not realize back then was that he was slowly training the people around him to expect that version of him. The version who would bend without breaking, who would absorb tension instead of addressing it, who would prioritize stability even when it came at a quiet personal cost. Over the years, that pattern became invisible because it felt normal. There was no single moment where everything collapsed. There was only a gradual shift where his own voice became less present in his own life. And the most unsettling part was not the conflict he avoided. It was the realization that he had become so good at adapting that he no longer knew where the line was supposed to be. That was the version of Daniel who believed compromise was strength. And for a long time, it looked like it was working. Until it did not. The shift did not come with a dramatic argument or a moment anyone else would remember. It happened on an ordinary night, the kind that would have blended into 100 others before it. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table long after everything had gone quiet, staring at nothing in particular, replaying another conversation that had already ended. Nothing explosive had been said. No lines had been crossed in a way that could easily be pointed out. And yet something felt heavier than usual, like a weight that had been building for years had finally settled all at once. For the first time, he was not thinking about what he could have said better or how he could have handled things differently. He was asking a different question entirely. He was asking why he always had to be the one adjusting in the first place. That question did not come with anger. It came with clarity, a slow, uncomfortable realization that he had been measuring the success of his relationships by how much of himself he was willing to set aside to keep them intact. And in that moment, he saw it clearly. He could not remember the last time he made a decision in a relationship that was fully aligned with what he actually wanted without immediately filtering it through someone else's expectations. That realization did not feel dramatic. It felt quiet, almost still, but it changed something fundamental. Because once a man notices that he has been living that way, once he sees how much of his life has been shaped by constant adjustment, the idea of continuing like that no longer feels responsible. It feels unnecessary. And that is where everything begins to turn. What Daniel began to understand in the days that followed was not just that he had been compromising, but what? Those compromises had actually been costing him over time. It was never just about agreeing on small things or keeping the peace during difficult moments. It was about the slow erosion of something far more important. Every time he chose silence instead of honesty, he lost a little clarity about who he really was. Every time he adjusted his boundaries to avoid discomfort, he weakened the sense of self that had taken him decades to build. It showed up in subtle ways at first. He felt more drained at the end of conversations that should have felt normal. He started needing more time alone just to recover from interactions that once felt easy. His patience became thinner, not because he had changed, but because he had been stretching himself beyond what felt natural for too long. And the most revealing part was how his body reacted. There was a quiet tension that followed him, even in moments that were supposed to feel calm. That tension was not random. It was the accumulation of every time he ignored what he knew was true just to maintain a sense of harmony. For years, he thought compromise was something that held relationships together. But now he could see the other side of it. When compromise becomes constant, it does not strengthen connection. It slowly replaces authenticity with performance. And once a man recognizes that he has been performing in his own life, the desire to keep doing it does not feel like loyalty anymore. It feels like a cost he is no longer willing to pay. At first, the silence felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable in a way Daniel could not immediately explain. There were no conversations to manage, no subtle tensions to anticipate, no emotional calculations running quietly in the background. Just space. And in that space, something unexpected began to happen. His thoughts, which had once been scattered and reactive, started to settle. Mornings became slower, not out of emptiness, but out of intention. He would sit by the window with a cup of coffee, not rushing into anyone else's expectations, not preparing himself to adjust or respond, just existing without the need to perform. It was in those quiet moments that he realized how long it had been since he had experienced that kind of stillness without interruption. Before, he had associated being alone with something missing, something lacking. Now it felt like something returning. There was no pressure to explain himself, no need to soften his words, no underlying tension waiting to surface. The absence of all that did not feel like loss. It felt like relief. And the more time he spent in that state, the clearer it became that this was not isolation. It was restoration. The version of himself that had been buried under years of constant adjustment began to reappear, not dramatically, but steadily. His preferences became clearer. His boundaries felt more natural. His energy was no longer stretched thin across expectations that were never fully his. What once felt empty was now the only place where he felt fully present. And that realization changed the meaning of being alone entirely. As the clarity settled in, Daniel also began to see something else with a level of honesty he had avoided for years, the pattern of relationships that had quietly shaped how he lived. Helen Brooks was not a villain in his story, and that was what made the realization even more difficult. She represented something far more common, a kind of connection where expectations were constant, but understanding was selective, where presence was required, but individuality was often negotiated away in small, almost invisible ways. With her, and with others before her, Daniel had learned to anticipate reactions before speaking, to soften truths before expressing them, to adjust his pace so it would not disrupt the rhythm someone else needed to feel comfortable. None of it looked extreme from the outside. That was the point. It was subtle, consistent, and over time it became normal. But now, standing at a distance from it, he could finally see what it had required of him. It was not just effort. It was a quiet agreement to place his own sense of ease second, again and again, until it no longer felt like a choice. And what he understood now was not rooted in resentment. It was rooted in recognition. A relationship that asks a man to trade his internal stability for external. Harmony is not balanced, no matter how calm it appears. And once Daniel saw that clearly, once he understood that respect includes space, honesty, and the freedom to exist without constant adjustment, he could no longer step back into that pattern without feeling the cost immediately. That awareness did not push him away from connection. It refined what kind of connection he was willing to accept. When everything is put together, what Daniel has come to understand is not a single lesson, but a pattern that explains why his priorities shifted so completely. It was never just about one relationship or one moment of realization. It was the accumulation of years where effort did not always lead to balance, where patience did not always create understanding, and where staying did not always mean growing. He can now see the difference between connection that adds to his life and connection that quietly drains it. He can feel the difference between peace that is shared and peace that is sacrificed to keep things from falling apart. And once that difference becomes clear, it changes the standard entirely. What many people misunderstand is that this shift is not driven by disappointment alone. It is driven by awareness. Older men like Daniel do not step back because they no longer believe in relationships. They step back because they finally understand that not all relationships are worth the same cost. What once looked like commitment now has to meet a different standard, one where respect, space, and emotional honesty are not optional. And if those things are not present, the absence is no longer something he is willing to negotiate around. This is where the real shift happens. It is not about choosing to be alone instead of being with someone. It is about choosing not to return to a version of life where being with someone meant slowly losing himself in the process. And once that standard is set, it becomes very difficult to lower it again. In the end, what changed Daniel was not a single decision, but a quiet refusal to keep living in a way that no longer felt true to who he had become. There was no announcement, no need to explain himself to anyone who could not already see it. The shift was internal, steady, and irreversible. He no longer measured his life by how well he maintained connections that required him to shrink. He measured it by how aligned he felt when the day ended, by whether his time, his energy, and his presence were being used in ways that actually reflected what mattered to him now. And for the first time in a long time, the answer began to feel clear. The silence in his home was not something he rushed to fill. It was something he protected, not because he had given up on people, but because he had finally stopped giving up on himself. There's a difference between being alone because you have no options and being alone because you have standards. From the outside, those two can look identical, but from the inside, they feel completely different. One feels like absence. The other feels like control. Daniel was no longer reacting to what life placed in front of him. He was choosing what he allowed into it. And that choice, simple as it sounds, is something many men spend decades trying to reach. Some never do, because it requires letting go of the idea that staying is always the right thing to do. Sometimes the strongest decision a man can make is not to hold on, but to step back, create space, and finally live a life that does not require constant negotiation with his own peace.